It's proclamation news and governance with the prodigious, the prominent Professor Johnson. Um, my academic integrity of arts and humanities, history and politics. Understanding politics, ideas, institutions in the modern world. This is the first book or the first module of our third year, DD 211. We're going to look who the references are in the book, because when you read a book and you're reading it out to other students or the tutors listening, we need to look at who edited the book so they can find out where you left off and record your reading. It's very important. I'm trying to influence you for today, young adults, young teenagers, mature teenagers, to record their reading, to listen back over the notes, and also have a load of pens, highlighted pens, to highlight a relevant material when you come to your assignments. Edited by Geoff Andrews, Agnes Sijaka, Andy O'Kane, Ray Prokovinik, and Dan Taylor. Open University. What is politics? Our first assignment is what is politics, who does politics, where is politics done, and how do we study politics? We've got a 500 worded assignment. So 125 words of each of that will make up a good argument in your studies. What, who, where, and how. Block 1. What is politics? Agnes Sijaka. Politics. Introduction. For writer Ernest Benn, politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it whether it exists or not, diagnosing it incorrectly and applying the wrong remedy. Quoted in spring 1944, page 31. This view of politics is certainly not uncommon. It is probably representative of how many of us have, at one time or another, felt about politics. A remark attributed to economist Milton Friedman. If you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert, in 5 years there'd be a shortage of sand. Expresses a similar sentiment. Leave it to politicians and they'll find a way to empty the desert of sand. Politics is a loaded term, one that evokes strong emotional responses from both critics and champions. Still greater contempt is often reserved for those who do politics for a living. Politicians are often the butt of jokes and subject of derision. Even Henry Kissinger himself, a political figure loathed by many, had little to say in defence of his profession when he opened that the majority of politicians taint the reputation of the good. Few quoted in Byrne 1984. If politics does indeed have a bad name, for the first question we might ask why that is the case. Those disillusioned with politics would have not shortage of evidence. Self-interest, deceitful, corrupt and aloof politicians. In contempt or unresponsive governments, the frequent pettiness and absurdity of political debate in both the government and the media. Political fraud, corruption, and nepotism are so commonplace in many parts of the world that they are no longer considered scandalous. While the situation might not be as a dire, the UK has certainly not been immune. 2013, Independent Jonathan Brown suggested that recent British scandals can compete with the best Europe can offer. A decade later, many would argue that matters have only gotten worse. Think, for example, of the numerous COVID-19 contract scandals that plagued Boris Johnson's Conservative government in 2021. And to this ineptitude of some politicians, the petty, at times violent brawls and erupt during parliamentary sessions in many parts of the world, and the often unspring levels of political debate. And it is no wonder that many have lost faith in politics and politicians and feel apathetic towards and disenfranchised from the political process. It is no wonder that many feel the world would be a better place if we could just put it to an end to politicking. Page 6. What is politics? But it is all that politics is about. Is there more to politics than what makes the headlines? Notorious for prioritising the shocking and scandalous. Does it extend beyond the politician and parties we often distrust, the halls of government most of us have little access to? The right to voting that many of us find increasingly inconsequential. This chapter is dedicated to answering precisely such questions. As someone embarking on the study of politics, you must already have a sense that there is no more politics than meets the eye. The chapter begins precisely from the premise that politics, and by extension, the actors in political dramas, and the stages on which politics is enacted, are far more ambiguous than we might originally suspect. Yet the question of what politics is, who is it done by, where it takes place, and how we study it elicit various, often contradictory responses in politics, as in much of the humanities and social sciences. Definite answers are difficult to come by. What politics is, who counts as a political actor, where politics takes place, and how best to study it are wholly debated and highly contested. Thus, rather than providing definite answers, the chapter will introduce you to different perspectives, at times competing or overlapping. It's up to you to decide which you find most compelling. Focusing primarily on the question of what politics is, Chapter 1 begins by considering a number of distinct definitions of politics. It's useful to conceptualize these definitions and existing along a spectrum. From a narrow, broad understanding of politics, the chapter considers the implications of understanding politics as a more narrowly or more broadly defined activity. As you read through the chapter, you will notice that this spectrum, although useful, will itself come under some scrutiny, particularly as we consider whether all of the definitions fall squarely towards the narrow or broad side, or whether some definitions are narrow in certain aspects and broad in others, or indeed could have both narrow and broad variations. Having considered a number of distinct distinctions of politics, the chapter proceeds to reflect on what such contradiction might mean for the practice and study of politics. It does so with the help of the term that has been immensely influential both in the study of politics and in the social sciences and the humanities more broadly, essentially contested concept, the phrase. Originally coined by the social and political theorist Walter Bryce Galilee, was popularized by William E. Connolly in the seminal book The Terms of Political Discourse, first published in 1974, Connolly 1933. The idea that definitions of concepts such as a concept of politics in general, but also more specific political concepts like freedom or equality, are disputed in a way that two or three incompatible definitions could all be equally legitimate, will serve as a guiding principle of this model. The first chapter will introduce you to the idea and explore the implications for the study of politics and now for the nature of knowledge in the social sciences and humanities more generally. Politics in general. Specific political concepts like freedom or equality are disputed. Freedom and equality are disputed. I might highlight that because that's not a bad thing to. Uh, I'll highlight that because that's a good question there. So, the many meanings of politics. What then is politics? To this, page 8, what is politics? Chapter 1, what is politics? To this deceptively simple question, there's actually a simple answer. No simple answer. Throughout the history of the discipline, political theorists and practitioners have offered multiple, at times contradictory, at times overlapping definitions of what politics involves. Thus, it is difficult, if not impossible, to provide a single definition of politics that everyone can agree on. The best we can do is to explore some of the more salient definitions of politics and see how they compare and contrast. This requires that we develop some sort of framework, some way of organising these definitions. In this section, we try to make sense of them by locating them on a spectrum that stretches between a narrow and broad interpretations of politics. We begin on the narrow side of the spectrum and consider the implications of defining politics as an activity restricted to specific people and places. We then explore some broader definitions of politics and consider the implication of expanding the remit of politics to include some perhaps less obvious activities, people and places. Politics as that which concerns the state. Among the narrow definitions of politics is politics defined as that which concerns the state, as distinction from the government. The state comprises the permanent institutions that provide public services, enforce laws, ensure security, and thereby provide for the governance of persons and the administration of things. The government, on the other hand, is composed of politicians who generally run the state because they have been elected, at least in democracies, to do so. They determine the public services and state should provide. Laws it ought to enforce, the form of security it should ensure, and the purpose for which the state should govern people and administer things. Politics defined as that which concerns the state can include activities that neither involve or some ways directly affect the institutions of the state, individuals who are directly involved in the institution of the state or the business of governance, and in places which these activities and people are present. On this definition, the following could include the remit of politics, interactions between states and international arena, the activities of politicians and activities such as voting in international, regional or local elections, through which individual citizens engage with the state. In even more concrete terms, politics that which concerns the state might include bilateral meetings between Canadian and Russian foreign ministers to resolve their territorial disputes in the Arctic, multilateral meetings between multi-groups organised under the auspices of United Nations to discuss issues such as climate change or nuclear non-proliferation. The day-to-day activities of the European Commission in Brussels, which drafts proposals for new European laws, debates and votes in UK Parliament and governance policy, or propose legislation on citizens voting in general elections to choose the next government. As you can see from the definition, politics, even in a narrow sense, is about much more than activities of politicians. Even when politics is confined to which concerns the state, it involves a whole host of activities, actors and spaces. The more abstract and metaphorical space of the international sphere to more concrete places and United Nations headquarters. In New York or Palace of Westminster, London, through a variety of state institutions, governments make and enforce laws that govern the conduct of those within their jurisdiction. They raise taxes through which they provide public services such as infrastructure, healthcare, education, employment, and other social services, of course. Not all states provide citizens with the same kind of or quality of services. Likewise, successive governments may not always provide the same kinds of services as their predecessors. Thus, while one government may be concerned with the issue of national defence and channel more of its tax revenue towards the armed forces, another may reduce military spending and channel more revenue into infrastructure or healthcare. Another government will still may choose to raise levels of taxation in order to afford increased spending on both areas. In addition to regulating and governing, I like that actually. I'm going to highlight that. I'm going to highlight this definitely. Page 9, and I want that page and page 9 and 10. Right. In addition to regulating and governing the conduct of those in their jurisdictions by they persons, corporations, or other entities, and providing public services, governments also interact with other governments in the international arena. In most extreme of situations, they may go to war with each other. More frequently, however, they interact with each other through international or regional organisations that attempt to regulate inner state affairs, such as the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, or the African Union. Through participation in regional and international organizations, states attempt to cooperate on issues of a regional or global scope, such as international trade, by establishing tax-free trade zones or principles of fair trade. International crimes such as drug trafficking or privacy, and global environmental issues such as climate change. Given that all this can fall within the remit of politics defined as that which concerns a state, you might be thinking that the definition of politics is not actually particularly narrow. It does, after all, seem to include a lot of activities, actors, and spaces. Indeed, many would agree with this assessment, but as you would see later in this section, for many others, this definition is still too narrow, as it excludes or overlooks the myriad of political activity that does not directly involve the state, and anti-war or anti-globalization protests political are boycott campaigns such as global boycott of Nike in the 1990s, or the more recent boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against Israel, political or animal rights movements, or even the choice to not consume meat. Political for many of those who argue for a broader interpretation of politics. These can be indeed be political, thus, while incorporating a number of different activities across and places. The first definition is, according to such arguments, too narrowly focused on the state. Politics as conflict resolution. A second definition of politics goes some way towards ameliorating this problem. It removes the state as a focus of politics and defines politics as a particular kind of process. Politics, on this definition, is a particular method for resolving conflict. Among the best known proponents of such an understanding of the politics was the political scientist Bernard Crick. Crick defines politics as the activity by which different interests within a given unit of rule are conciliated by giving them a share in power in proportion to their importance to welfare and the survival of the whole community. Crick, 1946, page 21. Later, he defines politics even more broadly, suggesting that politics is a solution to the problem of border which chooses conciliation rather than violence or coercion. One important aspect of Crick's definitions is the distinction he draws between politics and violence or coercion. For Crick, politics is the definition distinct from violence, he is by no means alone in drawing this distinction. Another influential political theorist likewise insisted on the distinction between politics and violence. The association of politics with non-violent conflict resolution is also present in everyday language, a political solution to a problem, such as a protracted territorial dispute between India and Pakistan in Kashmir or the war in Yemen, is one that involves peaceful negotiation and arbitration. By contrast, a military solution implies the use of force. Thus, on this definition, politics is not necessarily related to a particular object, and in the first definition we are looked at, according to which politics is that which concerns the state, but refers to the process by which problems are solved and decisions are made. Although a definition of politics as a way of problem solving that is distinct from violence does not necessarily imply that it takes the form of party politics, Crick, other work, and perhaps his personal involvement in British party politics have led to criticism that he is indeed biased towards party politics. One might preserve a hint on this bias in the first of Crick's definitions above. In his focus on proportional power sharing, for instance, thus for some, Crick's interpretation of politics is still too narrowly focused. If not on a state as such, then on a particular kind of political process, one closely related to pluralist democracies and having little relevance in non-democratic or non-pluralist contexts where, as critics might argue, politics is still present. Here's another challenge that proponents and broader definition of politics could level at Crick's definition. Are politics and violence mutually exclusive? Or does the rigid separation of politics form violence and perhaps even more so form coercion? Exclude a whole host of actions that should be included under the rubric of the political. Is the destruction of property, anti-capitalist protesters, smashing bank machines, or animal rights, activists throwing paint on expensive fur coats, political? Are suicide bombers acting politically, or are they engaging in violence? Pure and simple, entirely eschewing the political process. Are revolutions generally defined by their violent character? Political. For these for whom politics is a non-violent method of conflict resolution, these would probably not qualify as political actions. Yet for many others, the distinction between politics and violence is not less straightforward. In this figure, violence for both. In Minneapolis, in Minnesota, in the aftermath of 2020 protests followed by killing of George Floyd by police officers Derek Chauvin. An even more fundamental problem raised by the above discussion is that of definition. We might ask, for instance, what constitutes violence, or, for that matter, coercion? Does the destruction of property constitute violence? At what point does exerting pressure on someone become coercion or violence? There is no contentious question which elicit contentious and contested answers. We will attend more closely to contestability of concepts later in this chapter, yet it is more important to red flag it here, as the conceptual choices we make between different definitions of violence or politics, for instance, determine how to interpret that world around us. If we keep moving in the narrow towards the broad side of the spectrum, the political scientist Andrew Hayward offers a somewhat broader definition of politics. He defines politics as an activity through which people make, preserve and amend the general rules under which they live. He goes on to characterize politics as a process of conflict resolution, whereby an attempt is made to reconcile rival interests, although in the end, Conflict may not be resolved. Politics is categorized by a search for such resolution. With its focus on conflict resolution, this definition shares some commodities with Crick's, yet there are also some differences. Crick defines politics as a particular way of resolving conflict, the proportional sharing of the power by different interests and narrow its scope, by noting that it takes place within a given unit of rule, such as a state. Arguably, Hayward's definition is broader, extending political activity beyond units of rule, and defining it as a search of consolation as opposed to its achievement. Let's scrutinise this definition. We might think about what other definitions Hayward's understanding of politics depends on. Among the most obvious is the definition of conflict, and by extension, is resolution. We might ask what we qualify as a conflict or its resolution. For instance, would a resolution of conflict necessarily require consensus or everyone's agreement on a particular solution, or simply a majority agreement? For some political theorists, politics is, or at least ought to be, a process of consensus building. For others, reconciliation and consensus are not necessarily the desired outcome. This leads us to second, perhaps even more fundamental question we could ask of this or any other definition of politics and what normative or value judgments it is permissed. Both Hayward and Crick define politics as a process whose end goal is the reconciliation of differences and the resolution of conflict. Thus, put very simply, it could be argued that their definitions are permissed on the assumption that difference and conflict are undesirable and their reconciliation and resolutions desirable. Without explicitly stating it, both Crick and Hayward start from the normative assumption that difference and conflict are bad, and their mitigation, reconciliation or resolution good. Therefore, their definition of politics, although seemingly merely descriptive and actually built on some normative assumptions about what is good and bad, desirable and undesirable, that is important to realise as political analysts, is at least in part about unearthing the often implicit normative assumptions present in political statements and practices. I'll leave that there. I can go back over that tomorrow. But I'm going to leave that there, ladies and gents. Have a good one, and I'll catch you again tomorrow. I'm trying to engage my brain with the reading. I have to read over it again, double my reading up. Anyway, take care, one love, and speak soon.